So we have about 15 minutes to do some Q&A. And I think the first one, Scott, that came in was for you. How have you utilized arbitration in unique ways to further Monsanto's dispute resolution initiative, if you have it all?
Yeah, we have used arbitration. It's frankly a last resort. Arbitration, much like litigation, is an indication that we have failed to resolve the dispute, and we require a third party to come in and assist us or make a decision. So frankly, we, from my perspective, like to use it as little as possible. We've reduced the amount of arbitration over the last 3 years to only 2 instances. And we've done it with a single arbitrator in both instances, and we've done it on the briefs. And in one instance, we did it only with document production. I found arbitration, frankly, it's touted as being faster, cheaper, fairer. I'll argue the contrary view on all 3. Would rather resolve it and make the effort to resolve it ourselves.
Thank you. So Deb, the next one is for you. What is the difference between emotional intelligence and relational intelligence?
So I think of relational as the process by which we are in relation to one another. And we have sort of the idea of emotional intelligence is my ability to connect with, understand, and manage my emotions. Social intelligence being my ability to manage, my ability to recognize and work with when I am in relationship to another. And relational intelligence, putting those two together, but also appreciating that my relation is in a system, a bigger system. So that system may be a family system, it may be a work system, it may be, out at a ball game, I'm in a system there. And so it's not just my ability to be socially connected to you and understanding that, but the idea that there's a context and a system within which that relationship happens.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. And Scott, you seem to be very popular today for some reason. Doesn't surprise me at all. There are 2 questions here that I think are actually fairly similar. So I will hit you with both at the same time, if I may. One is, how can your model work between parties with unequal power? For example, a sole inventor versus a Monsanto. And the second one is, could you see the Monsanto dispute model applying to other organizations, such as small businesses or public organizations? And in both these cases, would something have to be done differently than the one that you developed for Monsanto with your large competitive
a lot of insight.
cohorts?
Yeah, a lot of insight there. Actually, it can. I focused on our major competitors, the multinationals, the Dow, DuPont, BASF, Bayer, Syngenta, and Monsanto, where we have relatively equal bargaining power. At least we're all big, put it that way. But relative to customers, farmers, farm organizations, smaller seed companies, they're licensees of our technology. And there's a natural tension there. We want to get paid as much as possible. They want to pay as little as possible. But there's relative equality in bargaining power. We need them as much as they need us. So I would submit to you, while there may be differences in relative size of entities or position of entities that are in a commercial relationship, and I'll tell you, we haven't extended any of this to the tort field, which is an entirely different planet of plaintiffs' lawyers in types of toxic tort things. But in the business context, the business relationship, I often find it's in equal poise. That even if it's a large company and being the provider and a small company being the purchaser, there's a commercial relationship that's in balance. And if that gets out of balance, it means that relationship itself is dysfunctional. So it's the foundation of that balanced relationship that creates the opportunity for a balanced resolution process. We haven't done any of this with governments, although I used many of the same principles with the multi-state state attorney general investigation and DOJ investigation, some of the same principles of communication and establishing relationships. And I didn't mention earlier that every one of those investigations, after 3.5 years, closed with no action, no settlement, no consent decree. I won't tell you how many tens of millions of dollars we spent in investigations that never should have been initiated, that were all closed with a simple letter saying we are closing our files and taking no action. But I also found with those government entities that communication is what really, and communication to a person. There's always a person at the other end of the Department of Justice. There's always a person in the White House or at the Federal Trade Commission. You just have to find who that person is to establish that line of communication.
Okay. Thank you very much. Jeremy, there's a question for you. At what point in the neurobiology cycle, emotional, social, rational, can mindfulness play a role and possibly change an outcome?
So mindfulness can play a role at all times. But I would say mindfulness is especially useful once you're in the post-conscious stage, because you're trying to be aware of yourself. So mindfulness is about your ability to be aware of everything going on inside you, your social patterns, your emotional patterns, your way of, am I in a C mode, am I in X mode ideally? But what I do think, and it goes on to what Deborah was also talking about compassion. I think there's some really useful stuff that is outside of mindfulness that goes into conditioning before you even go into the room. Because when you're in the room, you're about your presence and your quality of your ability to be mindful, which is incredibly helpful. Please don't get me wrong, it's vital. But what you can do beforehand, I think that the compassion stuff you were talking about was hitting a nerve with me there also. There's a neurobiological correlate in the difference between compassion and empathy. When we're in the room and we're being empathetic, we tend to also get into negative spiraling. But if you have a stance, you do a mantra, or you do a kind of a cognitive meditation on being compassionate, you tend to already improve your ability to interact with people in the room. There's some even evidence on like a power stretch. People who did a power stretch before going to negotiation performed better. And so there's that same element here where if you go in thinking compassionately towards yourself, towards others, but not just in general, you can think specifically about that opposing counsel. You can think about that client who's so frustrating. You can think about the average person you met on the bus that morning, or your child or a member of your family, normally with a reference to some person who incarnates perfect compassion. That helps inoculate you and give you a lot of positive energy, where compassion is a lot better in a mediation context, for example, than empathy, it seems.
Great. Thank you. Deb, for you, can you provide some insight into how to build support within an organization to get buy-in to create relationship-based models?
So helping the leadership have the capacity to engage with each other to start with at an authentic and relational way. And so a lot of the coaching that I do involves helping executives come to that realization of, if they're not treating each other well, if they're not engaging from a relational space, the fractal pattern of their conflict and their inability to work well together and create connection flows out into the organization. So always starting with, can the leadership team understand and appreciate and have a relational mindset that says relationships here actually matter, and our job is to foster and grow and nurture those. So that's really the starting point.
And Scott, for you, when and how is it best to raise the concept of a formal relationship-based process in an organization? And the corollary, are there times when it's best to avoid even bringing it up?
There are. The worst time to bring it up, it'll be the death knell, is when you're in the middle of a fight. The idea that you have this vision of some utopia, it's going to be viewed as a Trojan horse, most likely. So the time to bring this up is either when there is nothing happening, or best is in connection with actually doing a deal, where the barriers are down, hands are dropped, you've actually shaken hands, hopefully over a meal, and you've gotten something done, taking it to the next step. That's the first one of these we did, and it was by far, it was a breakthrough. And so when you end a conflict, to be able to capitalize on the end of that conflict to create a systematic approach, generally people's minds are more open and they're emotionally more capable of engaging in that discussion.
Well, terrific. I think we're about out of time, are we, Alexander? 5 minutes. Well,
Ooh la
good,
la.
because I have more cards. Jeremy, this then is for you. The statement is, culture is social, but can we consider the existence of a personal culture when someone develops behaviors that contrast with his or her national or regional culture?
So when you're looking at culture, you're looking at saliencies that are personal traits. And it's the group dynamics that are going to bring a different saliency in a different context. So it's very difficult to talk about the culture of an individual. It's always going to be something that is going to be systemic, going back to your approach also, Deborah, which is the presence and the relationship with others creates and triggers in you different patterns of behavior. We see that, for example, just with language. People who speak 2 or 3 languages will tend to think differently and have different personality traits when they're in their different language behavior. Some of that's cultural because when you learn the language, there are certain codes of behavior that come with it. But some of it's also just purely intuitively relational, and you don't even understand why. So when you go into a room and identify yourself as a lawyer to other lawyers, that's going to have a huge impact on whether you come into the room and, Deborah's case, because you're also a nurse, so you can, it's a completely different way of people reacting to you, how they brand and look at you, and therefore your own behavior can be different as well. So I think it's all about this notion of saliencies internally, and it's the group dynamic that is going to affect what's going on that you can't be in control of sometimes. It's an interactive, it's a systemic effect.
And I think we have time for one more, perhaps. So, Deb, if you can close out with this last one. What can thought leaders, such as the people in this room and at this university, do to promote the adoption of relationship-based processes?
So we'll do an improv exercise together to to put this point home. So this is called a voice mirror. So repeat what I say as I'm saying it, and it's the answer to this question. Okay? So repeat what I say as I'm saying it. It's all about me. So it's growing your own capacity to be in relation to others, because the only common denominator in our relationships is you. The better you get at that, the more you can model it, the more you can appreciate what it's like to help others do that. So that's my answer.
Well, and that's a wonderful ending to our session. I want to thank our panelists again. Help me thank them.